Welcome to Shadows of Black History. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is right now. I truly love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. If you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe and like this channel. Your support helps keep these powerful stories alive. I appreciate each and every one of you. Stay with me until the very end, because this is not just a story. It is an experience you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Tonight, you will hear about a woman no one feared until it was too late. A woman who waited in silence while powerful men laughed under bright lanterns. A woman who understood something about the forest that no one else on that plantation understood. Relax, clear your mind, remove distractions, and listen closely. Because on the night of October 22nd, 1857, 6 powerful white men believed they were safe inside their grand plantation house in Georgia. By sunrise, none of them would be alive. And the most terrifying part of that night was not the sound of screams. It was the patience that came before them. Red Hollow Plantation stood far from the busy docks of Savannah, surrounded by thick pine forests and heavy swampland that seemed to swallow sound whole. The estate was large and wealthy. Cotton fields stretched across the land like waves of white under the Georgia sun. The main house stood tall, with wide columns and polished floors that reflected lantern light like gold. The master of Red Hollow was a man who believed control was permanent. He believed his land, his money, and the people he owned were all secure under his command. He believed nothing could reach him inside his own walls. Among the enslaved people who worked his land was Minerva Hall. She was not known for rebellion. She did not argue. She did not speak loudly. She worked in the barns, tending livestock, and sometimes assisted in the main house kitchen when needed. She carried herself with calm steps and lowered eyes. People described her as quiet, strong, and distant. They thought silence meant surrender. They never saw the storm forming behind her steady gaze. 8 months before that October night, everything in her life changed. Her daughter, 14 years old, had been ordered into the main house under the excuse of cleaning duties. The girl had soft eyes and quick hands. She was learning to sew. She still hummed when she worked. That afternoon, the master entered the room. The overseer followed. A visiting doctor from Savannah stepped inside. A slave trader who had come to inspect inventory closed the door behind him. By the time the sun dropped below the trees, Minerva's daughter had been violated and beaten. Her cries were heard faintly through walls, but fear kept everyone frozen in place. Within days she was sold, taken to Savannah, sent to a brothel near the docks where ships arrived heavy with goods and left heavy with secrets. The plantation ledger recorded her sale as profit. $400. Nothing more. No mention of her name. No mention of pain. Minerva ran to the master's porch, begging. She fell to her knees. She pleaded for mercy. The master struck her across the face and told her to remember she was property. That was the moment something inside her shifted from grief to cold clarity. She stopped crying. She stopped begging. She became quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. In the weeks that followed, Minerva began walking toward the tree line each evening after her work was finished. At first, people assumed she went there to grieve alone. No one questioned it. Grief made people avoid you, but Minerva was not wandering aimlessly. As a child, before she was sold south, she had lived near Forest Hills. She had watched hunters track wildcats. She had listened carefully, as older men explained how scent controlled instinct. She had learned how patience could bend even the fiercest creature. The forests surrounding Red Hollow were known for black panthers. Their movements were silent and sudden. Cougars roamed deeper swamps. A lynx had been seen near the river bend the previous year. Most people feared these animals. Minerva began studying them. She examined tracks pressed into soft earth. She watched where prey disappeared. She learned which paths led closest to the plantation without being seen. Then she began leaving scraps of meat far from the estate, so no one would notice missing portions. She built crude cages using broken wagon iron and heavy timber pieces discarded near the barn. It took strength and patience. It took nights alone in darkness, where every snapping branch could have meant her death. But fear no longer ruled her. 1 month passed, then another. Slowly, she succeeded. The first panther was trapped carefully without killing it. She reinforced its enclosure. Weeks later, she captured another. 3 cougars followed over time, each secured through careful bait and timing. Finally, a lynx, smaller but sharp and fast, was captured. 6 wild predators hidden deep in the Georgia forest. She did not tame them like house animals. She conditioned them. She brought cloth secretly taken from the master's coat, a handkerchief from the overseer's pocket, a rag from the doctor's medical bag, a strip torn from the slave trader's saddlecloth. Each time she fed the animals, she tied one of those cloths near the meat. Again and again. Over 8 long months, the connection grew stronger. The scent meant food. The scent meant release. The scent meant movement. No one on the plantation noticed the scratches along her arms, or the mud staining her dress. They believed sorrow had broken her spirit. They did not realize sorrow had sharpened her mind. October 22nd arrived quietly, with cool air drifting across the cotton fields. That evening, the master hosted a private gathering inside the main house. The overseer attended. The doctor returned from Savannah. The slave trader came once again to discuss future transactions. 2 additional men joined them, wealthy and confident in their laughter. 6 men in total sat around a polished table, raising glasses and celebrating profit. Lanterns glowed warmly against white walls. The veranda doors were left open to allow fresh air inside. Music from a fiddle echoed softly in the background. Outside, the forest stood silent under a rising moon. Earlier that night, Minerva had walked alone into the woods one final time. She carried fresh meat and the familiar scent cloths. She tied them carefully along branches, leading from the forest edge toward the open veranda doors. She placed meat in intervals, guiding a silent path straight toward the light. Then she stepped back into darkness and waited without moving. The first sound was so faint, it could have been mistaken for wind. Leaves shifting, a low rumble carried by night air. The chained dogs near the barn began to whine and pull at their restraints. Inside the house, laughter grew louder. A chair scraped across the floor. A glass lifted in toast. Then claws touched the wooden veranda. The first panther entered like a shadow, sliding across polished wood. For 1 second, no one reacted. They thought it was imagination. Then the second panther stepped fully into lantern light. A cougar followed behind it, muscles tight and eyes fixed. Another cougar slipped inside with silent precision. The lynx moved low along the wall, unseen until too late. Panic exploded instantly. The animals did not scatter randomly. They moved with focused intention toward the scents they had learned for 8 months. The master reached for his pistol, but never fired. The overseer shouted once before being dragged down. The doctor stumbled backward into a table. The slave trader tried to run toward the veranda, but claws met him before he reached it. Lanterns crashed to the floor. Music stopped mid-note. Screams tore into the Georgia night, and beyond the pine trees, Minerva stood perfectly still, her breathing steady, knowing that what began inside that house would not end when the screams stopped. The screaming did not stop all at once. It faded in layers. First, the loud, desperate cries of men who had never imagined fear would reach them. Then the crashing of overturned chairs. Then the violent shattering of glass. And finally, the heavy sound of something falling and not rising again. Outside, the forest held its breath. Minerva did not move. She stood just beyond the reach of lantern light, her eyes fixed on the doorway. Her hands did not tremble. She had imagined this moment for 8 long months, not with joy, not with pleasure, but with clarity. Inside the house, chaos had replaced confidence. The first man fell near the long dining table. The second stumbled backward toward the fireplace. One tried to crawl, leaving a smear across polished wood. Another attempted to shout orders as if command still meant something, but his voice broke into panic. The animals moved exactly as they had been conditioned, drawn toward the scent that had been paired with food again and again in the dark forest. They did not waste energy. They did not roam aimlessly. They followed what they knew. In less than 20 minutes, the room that had been filled with laughter was filled with silence, broken only by heavy breathing and the crackle of a fallen lantern flame beginning to catch the edge of a curtain. Servants had heard the noise from the quarters. At first, they thought it was drunken shouting, which was common on nights like this. But when the screaming turned sharp and desperate, something deeper stirred among them. No one rushed toward the house. Years of fear had taught them that rushing toward white men in distress rarely ended well. They gathered at a distance, eyes wide, hands covering mouths. A stable boy whispered that he saw shadows moving inside the windows, large shadows that did not look human. The chained dogs near the barn were losing their minds, pulling so hard against iron restraints that one nearly snapped. The forest around Red Hollow seemed alive, not with noise, but with tension. Then, as suddenly as it began, it quieted. One by one, the animals slipped back through the open veranda, their bodies low and swift. The panthers disappeared first, melting into darkness like ink spilled across water. The cougars followed, muscles coiled and silent. The lynx darted behind them, vanishing between trees as if swallowed whole. Within seconds, the forest looked the same as it always had. Only the house remained changed. Minerva waited until she was certain the animals had fully retreated along the path she had prepared. The scent cloths would continue guiding them deeper into the woods, where meat waited at the final marker. She had planned every detail. Even the wind direction had been studied. She turned away from the house before anyone thought to look toward the trees. Her steps were steady as she moved along a narrow path she knew better than any overseer ever could. Behind her, smoke began to rise slightly from inside the main house as the fallen lantern flame grew stronger. A servant finally found courage to approach the veranda. He stopped at the doorway, frozen by what he saw. 6 bodies lay scattered across the floor. Blood stained the polished wood. Tables were overturned. The master's hand still clutched the grip of a pistol he never fired. For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone screamed again, not in pain this time, but in horror at the sight. By midnight, riders were being sent toward neighboring plantations. By dawn, Red Hollow was no longer a symbol of power. It was a scene of shock. Men who had ridden confidently onto that property hours earlier now lay covered in sheets. The official explanation began forming immediately. Wild animal attack. A tragic intrusion from the forest. That was what they would say. They could not afford to say anything else. To admit that an enslaved woman had orchestrated such precision would mean admitting that control had been an illusion. Hunters were called from nearby counties. Traps were prepared. Hounds were brought in to track the predators responsible. Yet as morning light filtered through pine branches, something became clear. The animals had not behaved randomly. The bodies told a pattern. Those who had harmed Minerva's daughter lay dead. Others in the house, servants who hid or froze, were untouched. It was as if the forest had chosen carefully. That thought unsettled everyone. Minerva did not return to her cabin. She did not collect belongings. She had prepared for this night long before it arrived. Deep in the woods, beyond the final feeding point, she had hidden small supplies. Dried meat, water stored in sealed containers, a blanket wrapped in oilcloth. She reached that hidden spot just before dawn. The animals had already dispersed naturally after feeding. She had never intended to keep them captive beyond this night. Their role had ended. The forest reclaimed them as it always had. Sitting alone beneath tall trees, Minerva allowed herself one long breath. It was not relief. It was not celebration. It was something quieter. A recognition that a line had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. Somewhere in Savannah, her daughter might still be alive. That thought burned brighter than any memory of the house she left behind. This was not the end of her journey. It was only the first step into something far more dangerous. By afternoon, rumors began spreading across Georgia. 6 white men dead inside one of the strongest plantation houses in the region. Newspapers would later print cautious reports, describing it as a rare and unfortunate wildlife attack. Ministers would whisper about divine judgment without naming it. Plantation owners would double their patrols and reinforce their doors, but beneath every official explanation lived a question no one dared ask aloud. How had the animals known where to go? Why had they targeted specific men? And where was Minerva Hall? Back at Red Hollow, suspicion fell quickly upon the enslaved community. Cabins were searched. Men were questioned harshly. Women were threatened. But no one spoke of Minerva's months in the forest. Some had noticed her wandering. Some had seen scratches on her arms. But silence can be stronger than fear when it protects a truth too dangerous to reveal. Her absence was recorded as escape. Riders were sent toward Savannah and toward northern counties. Notices were quietly circulated, describing her height, her build, her face. They believed she would run toward the city in desperation. They did not understand that Minerva had never been desperate. She had been deliberate. As evening approached again, Red Hollow Plantation felt different. The grand house that once glowed with pride now stood heavy and guarded. No doors were left open. No music played. The forest surrounding it felt closer, as if the trees themselves had shifted inward. For the first time, those who claimed ownership of the land felt watched. And far beyond their sight, Minerva moved north through thick Georgia wilderness, guided not by panic, but by purpose, because the men who had destroyed her daughter were dead. But the system that allowed it was still alive. And Minerva had not yet decided whether her work was finished. By the 3rd day after the deaths at Red Hollow Plantation, the story had traveled farther than any rider on horseback. From Savannah to Macon, From rural crossroads to church pulpits, whispers spread like smoke that refused to clear. 6 powerful white men dead in a single night. Not by gunfire, not by poison, by claws. The official version called it a rare wildlife intrusion, a tragic accident. But those who had seen the bodies knew something about the scene felt deliberate. The wounds were not scattered without purpose. The men who had been closest to the master lay nearest to the center of the room. The doctor who had signed the sale documents was found near the fireplace, where he once laughed. The slave trader lay near the veranda door, where he had attempted escape. No servant had been touched. No random guest had been harmed. The pattern whispered of intention, and that pattern terrified more than the attack itself. Plantation owners across central Georgia began tightening control. Night patrols doubled. Guards were placed at the edges of tree lines. Dogs were kept closer to the house, rather than chained at barns. Invitations to large gatherings were canceled quietly. Windows that once remained open for evening breeze were sealed shut before the sunset. The forest was no longer background scenery. It had become a threat, and yet the forest had not changed. It still stood silent and ancient, indifferent to human power. What had changed was perception. For years, enslaved people had been forced to fear patrols, bloodhounds, and armed riders. Now, for the first time, some of that fear shifted direction. The men who believed themselves untouchable had felt vulnerability inside their own walls. Meanwhile, Minerva moved carefully through dense woodland, miles away from Red Hollow. She did not travel on main roads. She avoided clear paths. She moved at dusk and before dawn, resting during daylight hours in hidden pockets of brush. She had spent months studying the forest. Now it protected her. She carried only what she needed: dried food, water wrapped in cloth, a small knife. Her mind was sharper than any blade she held. She did not look back toward the plantation. She did not wonder whether the fire from fallen lanterns had consumed more than furniture. That house no longer mattered. What mattered was Savannah. What mattered was her daughter. The brothels near the docks were known for swallowing girls whole, changing names, erasing pasts. But Savannah was large, and large cities hold cracks where hope can slip through. On the 4th night of her journey, she heard riders in the distance. Voices carried through trees. Dogs barked sharply, then quieted. Minerva dropped flat against damp earth, pressing herself into the shadow of fallen branches. Lantern light flickered between trunks, searching. She did not breathe deeply. She did not shift. She had learned from watching predators that stillness can be more powerful than movement. The riders passed within yards of her hiding place. One man said her name aloud, mispronouncing it carelessly. Another laughed and claimed she would not last a week alone in the woods. When the sounds faded, Minerva remained still for a long time. Only when the forest returned to its natural rhythm did she rise and continue. That moment confirmed something she already understood. They feared her. Not just for what happened in that house. They feared what she represented. Back at Red Hollow, investigations continued. Hunters returned empty-handed. No panthers were captured near the estate. No cougars were found in traps. It was as if the animals had vanished with purpose. Some plantation owners began suggesting that perhaps the animals had been drawn by food waste or slaughter scraps. Others quietly wondered if someone had guided them, but no one dared say it publicly. To suggest that an enslaved woman had trained wild predators would challenge the foundation of belief that enslaved people were incapable of complex planning, and belief can be more fragile than wood under pressure. Ministers preached about order and obedience the following Sunday. They warned congregations that chaos comes when hierarchy is disturbed, but their voices carried unease because something had been disturbed and it was not easily restored. In Savannah, the docks remained busy. Ships arrived heavy with cotton and departed with manufactured goods. Sailors moved in and out of taverns. Brothels operated behind curtained windows. Girls with painted faces leaned from balconies under dim lanterns. Names were changed easily in that city. Identities blurred, but whispers travel through cities just as they do through forests. By the end of the week, even Savannah had heard of the night at Red Hollow. 6 men dead. Animals guided by scent. A mother missing. Some called her cursed. Others called her blessed. A few called her something else entirely. They called her the Panther Queen. Minerva reached the outer edges of Savannah after days of cautious movement. She did not enter the city immediately. She watched from a distance, observing traffic patterns and patrol routes. She studied which docks were busiest at night and which streets quieted after dark. She listened to conversations at watering wells where workers gathered. She learned quickly that brothels near the river operated under protection from certain officials. Bargains were made quietly. Protection was purchased. But even protected places have weaknesses. A delivery entrance, a shift change, a careless guard who drinks too much. Minerva knew that patience had carried her this far. Impulse would destroy everything. As night fell over Savannah, lanterns flickered along narrow streets. Music drifted from taverns. Laughter masked despair. Minerva wrapped her head in cloth and moved through shadowed alleys toward the district she had heard mentioned in whispers. She did not know whether her daughter was alive. She did not know whether her daughter would recognize her after months of suffering. But she knew one thing clearly. The men who destroyed her child were gone. Now she faced a city built on secrecy and profit, and somewhere inside it, her daughter waited, without knowing that the forest had already answered part of their pain. Minerva paused in the darkness, across from a narrow building with red curtains hanging inside upper windows. She watched carefully as a carriage pulled away from the entrance. 2 men stumbled out laughing. A woman in heavy makeup leaned against the doorway, her smile forced. Behind that doorway, behind that painted face, behind that guarded entry, might be the child she had carried 14 years before. Minerva closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath. The forest had obeyed her once. The plantation had fallen in less than 20 minutes. But the city was different. The city required another kind of patience, and as she stepped closer to that doorway, she understood that the most dangerous part of her journey was only beginning. Savannah at night did not sleep. It whispered. It bargained. It hid things in plain sight. Lanterns hung along crooked streets, casting yellow light over brick walls and wooden doors that had seen too much. Music drifted from taverns, where sailors spent wages quickly and asked few questions. Carriages rolled past in uneven rhythm. Somewhere far off, waves struck docked ships with steady sound. Minerva remained in shadow across from the narrow building with red curtains. She had watched it for hours without moving. Men entered through the front with coins and left with satisfaction or silence. Women stepped out only when told. No one lingered long near the door. That told her something important. This place was protected. Protection meant connections. Connections meant danger. She could not rush in, as she had guided predators into a plantation house. This required a different strategy. She observed which worker exited the back alley carrying refuse. She noticed a small delivery entrance used near midnight when shipments arrived. She watched a guard grow careless as drink made his posture loose. Every detail mattered. Patience had shaped her once before. It would shape her again. On the second night of watching, Minerva followed the refuse carrier at a distance. The young man moved quickly, head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might ask questions. When he turned into a dark alley to discard waste, Minerva stepped forward silently and spoke his name. He froze. She had learned it earlier from overheard conversation near the well. He stared at her, confused and frightened. She did not threaten him. She did not shout. She simply asked one question. "Are there girls inside who were sold from plantations recently?" He hesitated, fear tightening his jaw. She reached into her cloth wrap and showed him a small silver ring that once belonged to her daughter. The boy's expression shifted slightly. He whispered that many girls came and went, but one matched her description. Young, quiet, refused to speak most nights. He did not know her true name. No one there used real names. But he described a girl with eyes that looked as if they were always searching for something far away. Minerva felt her chest tighten. She asked when the girl would be alone. The boy shook his head. They were rarely alone. Guards rotated shifts. The madam kept close watch. Minerva understood. She thanked him quietly and melted back into shadow before anyone could see them speaking. Inside the brothel walls, life followed a harsh routine. Girls were prepared before sunset, faces painted, hair brushed, dresses adjusted, names assigned like costumes. Minerva waited until the third night to act. She had learned that near dawn, when the final guests departed and exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone inside, vigilance weakened. The back delivery entrance was unlocked briefly to allow waste removal. She approached at that hour, moving like she had through pine forest months earlier. When the door opened slightly, she slipped inside unnoticed, behind the refuse carrier, who kept his eyes forward and said nothing. The interior smelled of perfume and smoke. Hallways were narrow. Laughter from upstairs faded as the last customer departed. Minerva remained close to the wall, counting doors. She had memorized the description of the girl's assigned room. Third door on the left, near the stair landing. Her heart pounded harder than it had outside Red Hollow. She had faced wild predators without shaking. Now she feared what she might see behind that door. She reached it. Her hand hovered above the wood. She listened. Silence. Slowly, she pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The room was dim. A small candle burned low. On the narrow bed sat a girl with slumped shoulders, staring at nothing. Her hair was longer than Minerva remembered. Her face thinner. Bruises faded into yellow shadows along her arm. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the girl's eyes lifted. Recognition did not come instantly. It came slowly, like dawn breaking through fog. Minerva stepped closer and whispered her daughter's name. The candle flame flickered, as if reacting to breath held too long. Tears formed in the girl's eyes, but did not fall. She had learned not to cry where others could see. Minerva knelt before her and placed the silver ring in her hand. That was when the girl finally whispered one word. Mama. There was no time for long reunion. Footsteps echoed faintly downstairs. Minerva explained quickly in low tones that they would leave before sunrise. She had studied patrol patterns. She knew the rear alley would be quiet for a short window before morning deliveries began. She wrapped her daughter in a dark shawl and guided her toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier than any step she had taken through forest. They moved silently down the stairs, keeping to the wall. A guard snored lightly near the front door, drunk and unaware. The madam's office light was dim, but not fully dark. Minerva paused, listening. No movement. She led her daughter toward the back entrance, just as the refuse carrier opened it again. He met her eyes briefly, and stepped aside without a word. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten with early dawn. They walked quickly, but not in panic, blending with dock workers who rarely looked closely at women wrapped in shawls. By the time the sun rose over Savannah's rooftops, Minerva and her daughter were no longer inside city limits. Behind them, the brothel would wake to confusion. A missing girl, an unlocked door, questions asked, suspicion cast. But suspicion without proof is only noise. Minerva did not look back at the red curtains. She guided her daughter toward wooded paths beyond the city. The girl's steps were weak at first, but determination steadied them. They had survived different kinds of cages. One built of iron and scent in the forest. One built of walls and shame in the city. Now they moved toward uncertain freedom. As they reached the edge of the marshland north of Savannah, Minerva felt something unfamiliar. Not vengeance, not rage, something quieter, a fragile hope. Yet she knew the danger was far from over. Plantation owners still hunted her name. City officials would not welcome scandal. The system that allowed her daughter to be sold still existed. And as mother and daughter disappeared into the tall reeds beyond the docks, riders in the distance were already beginning to search. The forest had answered once. The city had yielded quietly, but the road ahead would test them in ways even Minerva had not yet imagined. The marshlands north of Savannah were wide and heavy with mist when Minerva and her daughter stepped into them before sunrise. The air smelled of salt and wet earth. Tall reeds brushed against their legs as they moved carefully through shallow water. Minerva did not walk in straight lines. She circled. She stepped into mud and then back onto stone. She paused often to listen. Behind them, Savannah would soon wake. The brothel keeper would count the girls. The guard would feel the sting of blame. Men with horses would be sent out, with anger burning in their chests. Minerva knew this. She had counted on it. Anger makes men loud. Loud men make mistakes. Her daughter walked close beside her, wrapped in a dark shawl. She was weak but alert. Each time Minerva stopped to listen, the girl did the same. They did not speak much. Words could wait. Survival could not. By mid-morning, they reached higher ground, where pine trees stood tall and the soil grew firm. Minerva led her daughter toward a cluster of fallen trunks that created a natural shelter. There they rested briefly. The girl's hands trembled from exhaustion, but her eyes held something steady. She asked softly if the men from Red Hollow were truly dead. Minerva did not answer immediately. She watched the wind move through the trees. Then she nodded once. The girl closed her eyes, not in celebration, but in quiet understanding. There was no joy in what had happened, only a shift in balance. Minerva explained that the men who harmed her would never touch another child, but the world that allowed it still existed. That world would search for them. That world would not forgive easily. The girl listened, and then said she was not afraid to keep walking. Minerva felt a small spark of strength rise inside her. As the sun lowered toward afternoon, distant barking cut through the air. Not close, but close enough. Minerva stiffened and rose at once. Dogs. Riders would not be far behind. She guided her daughter toward rocky terrain, where scent would be harder to follow. They moved quickly, but carefully, avoiding dry leaves that cracked underfoot. When they reached a narrow stream, Minerva stepped directly into the water and walked along its course for several long yards before climbing out on the opposite side. She had once used knowledge of scent to guide wild predators. Now she used it to confuse men who hunted her. The barking grew louder for a moment, then scattered, then faded into frustrated shouts. A rider cursed her name into the trees. The sound did not shake her. It confirmed what she already knew. They were afraid of what she had done, afraid of what she represented. Night approached again, heavy and quiet. They did not dare light a fire. Hunger pressed against them, but fear of smoke was stronger. Minerva wrapped her daughter in the oilcloth blanket she had carried since leaving Red Hollow. The girl leaned into her mother and finally allowed a few tears to fall, silent and quick. Minerva held her tightly, but kept her eyes open, listening to every sound around them. An owl called from somewhere high above. A branch snapped in the distance, but it was the sound of deer, not men. The forest did not judge them. It did not accuse them. It simply existed. As her daughter drifted into restless sleep, Minerva stared into darkness and thought not of vengeance, but of the road ahead. Revenge had been fire. Escape would be endurance. By dawn, the riders would search again. By noon, they might be closer. But Minerva understood something clearly as the first faint light touched the trees. She had survived the plantation. She had walked into the city and walked out again. And now, with her daughter beside her, she was not running blindly. She was moving with purpose toward a freedom that would test them both in ways far greater than any night of claws and lantern light. Dawn came pale and cold, spreading thin light across the forest floor as Minerva gently woke her daughter. They had rested only a few hours, yet they could not afford more. The barking from the previous afternoon had faded during the night, but Minerva knew pursuit would return once riders regrouped. Plantation owners did not accept humiliation quietly. The deaths at Red Hollow had wounded pride more than flesh. Pride demanded action. She helped her daughter stand and examined the path ahead. The forest grew thicker toward the north, but beyond it lay farmland, small churches, and scattered cabins where rumors said certain doors opened at night without question. The Underground Railroad was not marked on maps. It existed in memory, in coded phrases, in shared risk. Minerva had heard about it for years in whispers while working in barns and kitchens. Now she would test whether those whispers carried truth. They walked through tall pines that filtered morning light into thin beams. The air smelled of sap and damp earth. After several miles, they spotted smoke rising faintly from a distant chimney. Minerva slowed immediately. A cabin in this part of the forest could mean safety or betrayal. She studied the ground for signs of patrol horses. She saw none. She guided her daughter in a wide circle until they approached from the back, keeping trees between them and the cabin. From behind a cluster of bushes, Minerva observed an older black woman stepping outside to hang cloth on a line. The cloth caught Minerva's eye. It was arranged in a specific pattern she had once heard described in hushed conversation. a square with a dark corner folded inward. It meant safe passage for those traveling north. Minerva felt a careful spark of hope. She stepped forward slowly, hands visible, and whispered the phrase she had been told long ago. The woman paused, studied her face, then replied with the answer. The door opened. Inside the cabin, the air felt warm and steady. The older woman introduced herself softly and offered water and cornbread. She did not ask for details. She did not need them. News of Savannah had reached even this quiet place. Word of Red Hollow had traveled faster than expected. The woman said that riders had passed nearby, asking questions about a dangerous woman and her child. Dangerous. The word carried weight. Minerva almost smiled at it. Dangerous to whom? She thanked the woman for shelter and explained they would not stay long. Too much time in one place increased risk. The woman nodded and pointed toward a narrow trail behind the cabin that led to another safe house 2 days north. She warned that patrols were increasing. Plantation owners feared rebellion. Fear often spreads wider than truth. By late afternoon, Minerva and her daughter resumed their journey, guided by the directions given. The forest thinned gradually, giving way to open stretches of land dotted with small farms. They moved mostly at dusk, when shadows lengthened and visibility lowered. Twice, they hid in tall grass as mounted riders crossed distant roads. Once, they lay flat beneath a broken fence while a patrol wagon creaked past, carrying armed men scanning the fields. Minerva's daughter no longer trembled at every sound. Hardship had sharpened her, too. When Minerva signaled stillness, the girl froze without hesitation. When she signaled move, the girl followed without question. Fear was still present, but it no longer controlled their steps. On the second night, they reached the next safe house, a small church with white paint peeling under moonlight. A single lantern glowed faintly inside. Minerva approached cautiously and knocked in the pattern she had been taught. A man opened the door slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness behind her before welcoming them in. Inside, the church pews were empty, but blankets lay folded near the altar. 2 other travelers sat quietly near the wall, a young couple who had fled a plantation weeks earlier. They exchanged nods of recognition. Shared struggle did not require many words. The man explained that a larger group would be moving north soon, toward a river crossing, where boats sometimes waited under cover of night. It would be dangerous. Patrols along the river had increased, but staying in Georgia was no longer an option for anyone hunted. That night, Minerva lay awake beside her daughter on a thin blanket near the church wall. She listened to the soft breathing of others in the room. She thought of the plantation house, filled with laughter before it fell silent. She thought of the red curtains in Savannah. Those places already felt distant, as if they belonged to another life. Yet consequences traveled quickly. Notices with her description were being nailed to posts. Rewards were likely being offered quietly. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a symbol that frightened powerful men. Symbols are pursued harder than individuals. She understood that clearly. When morning light filtered through cracked church windows, the man gathered them quietly and spoke in low tones. They would leave at sunset, with a small group heading toward the river. The journey ahead would test endurance. There would be little food and no certainty, but there would be hope. Minerva looked at her daughter and saw not the broken child taken months ago, but a young girl rebuilding strength with each mile walked. She squeezed her hand gently. The forest had protected them. The city had yielded. Now the road north would demand everything they had left, and somewhere beyond that river lay a place where no ledger could record their worth, and no master could claim ownership over their names. Sunset painted the sky in deep orange as the small group gathered behind the church. There were 6 of them in total: Minerva and her daughter, the young couple who had fled weeks earlier, an older man with a limp from a whipping years before, and the quiet guide who knew the path toward the river crossing. No one spoke loudly. Even their breathing seemed measured. The guide explained that patrols had doubled along the main road. They would avoid it completely. They would travel through fields first, then into thicker forest, and finally toward a narrow bend in the river where boats sometimes waited without lantern light. If they were seen before reaching that point, they would scatter in pairs and regroup further north if possible. Minerva listened carefully, memorizing each instruction. She had led predators once. Now she followed human strategy. The difference was clear. This time, she was not controlling danger. She was walking directly into it. They moved as darkness deepened, keeping low along fence lines and slipping through tall crops that scratched up against their clothes. Twice they froze when distant voices carried on the wind. Once they dropped flat into the dirt as 2 mounted riders passed along a ridge not far away. The sound of horse hooves thudding against earth echoed long after the riders were gone. Minerva's daughter clutched her hand tightly, but did not cry out. The girl's strength surprised even Minerva. Trauma had not broken her spirit. It had hardened it quietly. After hours of steady movement, the land began sloping downward. The faint sound of water reached them. The river was near. The guide signaled for silence. They approached through trees until the dark shape of water reflected faint moonlight ahead. At the river bend, a shadow moved near the bank. Minerva's heart tightened. The shadow stepped forward slowly and whispered a coded phrase. The guide answered. A small wooden boat emerged from beneath low-hanging branches where it had been hidden from distant patrol view. There would be 2 trips across to avoid overloading. Minerva insisted her daughter cross first, with the young couple and the older man. She would go on the second crossing with the guide. As the first group stepped into the boat, distant barking erupted again from far behind them. Dogs. The sound cut through night air sharply. The guide's jaw tightened. Riders had picked up a trail somewhere. The boat pushed off quietly, oars dipping into water with careful rhythm. Minerva remained on shore, listening as barking grew louder. Her daughter reached the opposite bank and turned, eyes wide but steady. The boat returned quickly. Time was thin. When Minerva stepped into the boat for the second crossing, a shout pierced the darkness from behind the trees. Lantern light flickered between trunks. Riders had reached the ridge above the river. A gunshot cracked through the night, the sound sharp and violent. The bullet struck water yards from the boat, sending a splash across Minerva's skirt. She did not flinch. The guide rowed harder, but kept strokes controlled to avoid capsizing. Another shot rang out, this one striking wood near the back of the boat. The river current tugged at them, pushing slightly off course. Minerva grabbed the side firmly, but kept her balance. On shore, riders shouted orders, trying to position for a clearer shot, but darkness and tree cover worked in their favor. Within moments, the boat reached the opposite bank. Hands pulled Minerva onto solid ground. They did not pause. They ran immediately into thick brush, as the guide dragged the boat into reeds to hide it once more. Behind them, riders cursed loudly, unable to cross without exposing themselves further downstream. The barking of dogs grew confused near the river's edge. Water breaks scent. Minerva had counted on that. The group moved uphill until breathing grew heavy, and legs trembled. Only when the forest swallowed the river completely did they sususu. The guide stopped and listened carefully. No more gunshots, no more clear voices, only distant frustration carried faintly through trees. They had crossed the border between counties. It did not mean safety yet, but it meant distance from immediate capture. Minerva turned to her daughter, who was shaking from adrenaline, but smiling faintly for the first time. They had faced pursuit directly and survived. As dawn began hinting at the horizon, the guide pointed north and said the next safe house lay 2 days ahead. Beyond that, further routes would lead into free territory if they continued without delay. Minerva looked back only once toward the direction of Georgia behind them. She felt no regret, only resolve. The plantation was ash in memory. The brothel was a shadow behind them. The river had carried them across more than water. It had carried them across fear. Yet Minerva understood something clearly. The world they were entering would not erase their scars. Freedom would not be simple. It would require rebuilding from pieces left behind. But for the first time in many months, the road ahead felt larger than the road behind. And as the group disappeared deeper into northern forest, under fading night, the riders on the southern bank could only watch the current move on without them. The forest north of the river felt different. The air carried a cooler edge. The trees stood tall and quiet. But the tension that had followed them for days began to loosen slightly. Not because danger was gone, but because distance had grown. Minerva walked steadily beside her daughter, each step taking them farther from Georgia soil. The guide moved ahead with careful pace, stopping often to listen. The young couple whispered occasionally about a farm rumored to offer shelter near the next county line. The older man walked with a limp but refused assistance, pride steady in his eyes. They were no longer running blindly. They were moving with direction. Yet Minerva knew the hardest part of freedom is not escape. It is what comes after. By the second evening, they reached a farmhouse set back from the road, its windows dark except for a single faint candle in the upper corner. The guide approached alone first and knocked gently in a pattern that sounded almost like ordinary tapping. A long pause followed. Then the door opened, just enough for a woman to peer out. After a few quiet words were exchanged, the rest of the group was welcomed inside. The farmhouse smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. A white couple stood near the hearth, their faces cautious but kind. They did not ask for stories. They offered water, warm food, and blankets. In the corner of the room hung a map with faint pencil markings tracing paths northward. One of those paths led beyond state lines, beyond slave patrol authority, into territory where slavery had already been abolished. Minerva stared at that map longer than she realized. It looked fragile, a few lines on paper. Yet those lines represented possibility greater than any weapon she had ever used. That night, as her daughter slept on a real bed for the first time in months, Minerva sat by the small window and watched stars scatter across the sky. She thought about Red Hollow Plantation, now leaderless and afraid. She thought about Savannah, where a missing girl would be quietly replaced in records. She thought about the river, about gunshots cracking through darkness, about the moment she stepped into water, knowing there was no turning back. She did not see herself as hero or villain. She saw herself as a mother who refused to accept the world as it was given. She knew that stories about her would grow and twist. Some would call her monster. Some would call her legend. But none of them would fully understand the long nights of patience before action, the quiet discipline, the refusal to surrender to despair. In the morning, the white farmer pointed toward a road that would lead them closer to free territory. He warned that slave catchers sometimes operated even across borders, chasing rewards offered quietly. Freedom required vigilance. Minerva nodded. She had lived with vigilance for too long to abandon it now. As they prepared to leave, the farmer's wife pressed a small bundle of food into her hands and whispered that courage travels farther than fear. Minerva held her daughter's hand as they stepped back into daylight. The group would separate at the next crossroads, each following routes arranged by hidden networks. Before parting, the guide clasped Minerva's shoulder once and said nothing. Words were unnecessary. As mother and daughter walked north under wide open sky, the land gradually changed. Fields replaced dense forest. Towns appeared where black families walked without chains. The air felt lighter, though scars remained heavy. Minerva knew that healing would not come in a single day. Her daughter would need time to reclaim her voice fully. She herself would carry memories that would never fade. Yet something profound had shifted. They were no longer property recorded in ledgers. They were travelers shaping their own direction. Behind them, Georgia continued its routines. Plantations harvested cotton. Notices faded from wooden posts. The story of the Panther Queen of Georgia would pass through whispers for years, growing larger with each retelling. But Minerva did not look back to measure her legend. She focused on the road ahead, on rebuilding life piece by piece. And so, their journey did not end with the fall of 6 men or the crossing of one river. It continued with each sunrise that found them still moving forward. Freedom was not a single moment of victory. It was a series of choices made daily against fear. As they stepped into a town where no one knew their names, Minerva paused and looked at her daughter. For the first time since that night in October, she allowed herself a small, steady smile. The forest had once answered her pain. The river had carried her beyond pursuit. Now the future waited, uncertain but open. And in that openness lay something far more powerful than vengeance. It was the quiet beginning of a life no master could ever claim again.